If you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to my channel Nightmare Archives. My grandfather's farm sits in the hollow of two rolling hills, far enough from town that the nights are thick with darkness. It's been 17 years since I left, but some memories from that place remain as vivid as fresh wounds. My name is Henry Coleman, and I grew up on that farm, a place of hard work, simple pleasures, and one unbreakable rule: never look at the barn at night if the lights appear. I was 6 when I first came to live with Grandpa Joe. My parents had died in a car accident on Route 16, the same winding road that led to his property. He was a tall, weathered man with calloused hands and eyes that carried the weight of secrets. Not the kind of man who knew how to raise a child, but he tried in his own way. Henry, he'd say, his voice gravel, rough from years of smoking hand-rolled cigarettes. This land gives us everything we need, but it asks for respect in return. The farm itself was unremarkable: 60 acres of decent land, a modest 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint, a chicken coop, and the barn. It was an old structure, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. During the day it housed our small herd of dairy cows, farm equipment, and bales of hay that I would climb like mountains. It smelled of sweet feed, manure, and engine oil. Ordinary farm smells that I found comforting. By day the barn was just a barn. I still remember my first week there, how Grandpa Joe had walked me through the property, showing me the boundaries of our land, teaching me the names of tools, introducing me to each cow by name. He was patient with me as I learned to collect eggs without frightening the hens, as I figured out how to milk without getting kicked. Regular chores structured our days: feeding animals at dawn, tending to the small vegetable garden, repairing what needed fixing. "You'll be good at this," he'd said one afternoon, watching me carefully brush one of the cows. "You've got gentle hands." But as dusk approached each day, something in him would change. His shoulders would tense. His eyes would dart toward the barn, and he'd usher me inside. It was during my second month at the farm when he first told me about the rule. We'd been sitting at the kitchen table, eating beef stew as the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the yard. Grandpa Joe had risen suddenly, pulling the checkered curtains closed with a swift movement. "Henry," he'd said, not looking at me, "there's something you need to understand about living here." I remember how he'd sat back down, pushing his half-finished bowl away, his weathered face serious in the yellow light of the kitchen. "Sometimes at night, there might be lights in the barn when there shouldn't be. If you ever see that, if you ever see a glow coming from there after dark, you go to your room, you lock your door, you pull your curtains, and you don't look. No matter what you hear, no matter how curious you get, you don't look." I'd nodded, too young to question why, but old enough to recognize the fear beneath his stern expression. "What makes the lights, Grandpa?" I'd asked. He'd been silent for a long moment. "Nothing good," he'd finally answered. "Nothing you ever want to see." That night I'd lain awake in bed, staring at my window, half hoping and half dreading that I'd see the mysterious glow. But the farm remained dark, the night quiet except for the distant hooting of an owl. For the first few years, I obeyed without question. Children accept the strange rules of adults as part of the mysterious architecture of the world. I never saw the lights, and eventually, the warning became background noise, like being told to look both ways before crossing the street or not to talk to strangers. Life on the farm followed the seasons. Spring brought calving and planting. Summer was for haying and swimming in the creek that cut through the back acres. Fall meant harvest and preparation. Winter was for repairs and stories by the wood stove. Grandpa Joe wasn't much for talking, but on those cold nights, he'd sometimes share tales of his own childhood, of his time in the war, of my father as a boy. Never once did he elaborate on the barn or its lights. School provided my only contact with other children. I'd ride the bus for 40 minutes each way, exchanging the isolation of the farm for the noise and chaos of elementary school. I made a few friends, but never invited them over. Somehow I knew the farm was our secret, that the rule about the barn wasn't something other people would understand. By the time I was 10, curiosity had begun to gnaw at me. The human mind doesn't do well with unexplained prohibitions. They become obsessions, itches that demand to be scratched. "Has anyone else ever seen the lights?" I asked one evening as we repaired a broken fence. Grandpa Joe's hammer paused mid-swing. "Your grandmother did," he said after a long silence. "Once was enough." "What happened to her?" I ventured. "My grandmother had died before I was born, and Grandpa rarely mentioned her. She got sick after," he said simply. No hand me those nails and stop asking questions that don't need answers. That was all I got from him, but it fueled my imagination. What could possibly be in the barn that could make someone sick? Radiation, a chemical leak, some bizarre farm accident. None of these explanations felt right, but they were more comforting than the alternatives my mind conjured in the dark. As I grew older, I became more observant. I noticed how Grandpa Joe would perform little rituals around the farm. He'd place iron horseshoes above every doorway. He'd scatter salt along the perimeter of the property every spring and fall. He kept a shotgun loaded with unusual shells by the back door, shells with strange markings carved into them. Once, when I asked him about these habits, he'd simply said, "Some traditions are worth keeping, even if you don't understand why." By the time I was 12, I'd developed the boldness that comes with approaching adolescence. I'd begun testing boundaries, staying up later, wandering farther into the woods that bordered our property. Grandpa Joe seemed to sense my growing defiance, his warnings becoming more frequent, more urgent. "The world's full of things we don't understand, Henry," he told me one evening. "As smart folks know when to leave well enough alone." It was around this time that I began to occasionally spy on the barn at night. I'd wait until Grandpa Joe was asleep, then creep to my window, which had a partial view of the structure. For months, nothing happened. The barn remained dark, a black silhouette against the star-filled sky, until it didn't. It was a Friday in late October, just before my 13th birthday. Grandpa Joe had driven into a town for supplies and to attend a meeting at the Elks Lodge. He'd left me alone, not the first time, but still a rare enough occurrence that it felt like freedom. I'd spent the evening watching TV, enjoying the luxury of controlling the remote, eating microwave popcorn for dinner. I'd been about to head to bed when I noticed it, a faint bluish glow filtering through the kitchen window. At first, I thought it might be headlights, Grandpa returning earlier than expected. But the light wasn't moving. It was steady, emanating from the direction of the barn. My heart began to race. After all those years of warnings, after all my failed attempts at nighttime observation, it was happening. The mysterious lights that my grandfather feared were finally appearing, and he wasn't here to enforce his rule. I stood in the kitchen, frozen between curiosity and dread. The sensible part of me, the part that respected my grandfather's wisdom, urged me to follow his instructions. Go to my room, lock the door, pull the curtains, don't look. But another part of me, the part that had been waiting for answers for 6 long years, whispered that this might be my only chance to discover the truth. What was so terrible that my grandfather had built his life around avoiding it? What had my grandmother seen that made her ill? What happened in that ordinary barn when darkness fell? I made my decision. Grabbing a flashlight from the drawer, I pulled on my boots and jacket. My hand trembled as I unlocked the back door. The autumn air bit at my cheeks as I stepped outside, the dried leaves crunching beneath my feet seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The path to the barn had never seemed so long. With each step, the blue glow became more distinct, filtering through the cracks between the weathered boards. It wasn't a harsh light, not like electricity or fire. It was softer, pulsing slightly like the light of deep sea creatures I'd seen in a documentary at school. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The usual nighttime sounds of the farm. The lowing of cows, the rustle of wind through the cornfield, the chirping of crickets had ceased. The world around the barn seemed suspended in an unnatural silence, as if holding its breath. Standing before the large double doors, I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. The glow was brightest at the seams, casting eerie blue lines across the ground at my feet. I raised my hand to the latch, then hesitated. "Don't look." My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, heavy with warning and fear. In that moment, I almost turned back. Almost. Instead, I crept around to the side of the barn, where a loose board created a small gap in the wall. I discovered this spot years ago, using it to sneak in for naps in the hay during hot summer afternoons. Now it would serve as my window into the forbidden. I switched off my flashlight, crouched down, and pressed my eye to the gap. What I saw inside would change me forever. Inside the barn, nothing was as it should have been. The familiar interior, with its stalls and hayloft, its stacks of equipment and feed bags, was transformed by the bluish light that seemed to emanate not from any single source, but from the very air itself. The light pulsed gently, like something breathing. It cast no shadows. Most disturbing was what I saw in the center of the barn: our cows, all 7 of them, standing in an unnaturally perfect circle. They were absolutely still, not shifting their weight or swishing their tails as cattle normally do. Their eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing. In the strange light, they looked like taxidermy specimens, preserved in a mockery of life. And moving among them were the figures. I counted 5 of them, though the shifting light made it difficult to be certain. They were tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, with limbs that seemed too long for their bodies. Their skin was the color of wet clay, a dull grayish hue that reflected the blue light in a way that hurt my eyes to look at directly. They moved with a jerking, insectal precision that made my stomach clench. Each motion seemed calculated, mechanical, yet fluid in a way no machine could move. Their backs were to me as they circled the cattle, occasionally reaching out to touch a cow's flank or head with long, thin fingers. I couldn't tell what they were doing exactly. It looked almost like they were examining the animals, or perhaps marking them in some way, though I saw no tools in their hands. Occasionally, one would make a gesture in the air, leaving trails of that same blue light hanging, suspended for moments before dissolving. The air around the barn didn't just look wrong, it felt wrong. The October night should have been cool, but near the barn, the temperature dropped to a biting cold that penetrated my jacket. The air felt thick, resistant, as if I were trying to breathe underwater. A metallic taste filled my mouth, like blood or old pennies. What struck me most was the silence. Our cows, normally vocal creatures, made not a sound. The figures worked in perfect quiet, communicating, if they communicated at all, in ways I couldn't perceive. The only sound was a faint, high-pitched hum that seemed to vibrate inside my skull rather than reaching my ears through the air. I must have watched for only minutes, though it felt like hours. Fear kept me rooted to the spot, unable to run but unable to look away. I had wanted answers for years, but what I was seeing provided none, only deeper, more terrifying questions. Then, without warning or apparent cause, one of the figures stopped its work. It went rigid, its 2 long arms hanging at its sides. Slowly, with a movement that reminded me of a crane or a praying mantis, it rotated its head. Only its head, a full 180 degrees to face directly toward my hiding spot. I'll never forget that face as long as I live. It had no features that could be called a nose or ears. The skin was smooth, almost polished looking, stretched tight over a skull that was subtly the wrong shape. Too wide at the top, too narrow at the jaw. Where a mouth should have been was only a thin, horizontal seam, like an envelope. But it was the eyes that haunted my nightmares for years afterward. They were huge, taking up too much of the face, and utterly black. Not dark brown or deep blue, but the absolute absence of light, as if someone had cut holes in reality. Within those abyssal pits, I sensed something looking at me with an intelligence that was completely alien yet undeniably aware. It saw me. It knew me. And in that moment of connection, I understood with perfect clarity that I was not meant to see this, that human eyes were never meant to witness whatever this was. The thing's mouth seemed parted slightly, revealing nothing behind it, and from that opening came a sound that I felt rather than heard. A vibration that shook my bones and made my teeth ache. The other figures stopped their work and began to turn. My paralysis broke. I stumbled backward, away from the gap, my foot catching on a root and sending me sprawling onto the hard ground. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, but terror gave me strength. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back, certain that if I did, I would see those figures emerging from the barn, coming for me with their 2 long limbs and their vacant black eyes. I ran as I had never run before, across the yard, up the porch steps, through the kitchen door that I'd left unlocked. My hands shook so violently that I could barely secure the deadbolt. I raced through the house, locking every window, every door, pulling curtains closed with desperate yanks that nearly tore them from their rods. Finally, I retreated to my bedroom, wedging a chair under the doorknob and burrowing under my blankets like I had as a small child afraid of monsters. But this was no childhood fancy, no dream-born terror. What I had seen was real, and that knowledge was the most frightening thing of all. I lay there shivering, straining my ears for any sound of approach. Would they come for me? What would they do if they found me? I thought of my grandfather's shotgun by the back door, but nothing could have compelled me to go back downstairs. Instead, I curled into a ball, my flashlight clutched in my sweating hand, and waited for morning or death, whichever came first. I don't know if I slept. The hours blurred together in a haze of terror and vigilance. At some point, I must have exhausted myself. For the next thing I clearly remember is the sound of Grandpa Joe's truck pulling into the driveway as dawn broke. The light filling my room was the normal, golden light of morning, nothing like the sickly blue glow from the barn. I uncurled my stiff body and went to the window. The farm looked perfectly ordinary in the early sun, the chicken coop, the vegetable garden, the old oak tree, and the barn red and weathered, standing as it always had. Except something was wrong. Something was missing. It took my exhausted mind a moment to realize what it was. There were no cows in the pasture. I was still staring at the empty pasture when I heard my grandfather's heavy footsteps on the stairs. He knocked once, then tried the door, finding it blocked by the chair. "Henry, you in there? Open up." His voice was the same as always, gruff, direct, but I detected an undercurrent of concern. I removed the chair and opened the door. Grandpa Joe stood there in the same clothes he'd worn yesterday, his face haggard with what I now recognized was fear. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning my face. I couldn't speak. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming. Though I didn't remember making a sound during the night, I just nodded. He studied me for a long moment, then said, "Come on downstairs. I'll make breakfast." I followed him to the kitchen, my legs unsteady. Through the window over the sink, I could see the barn. In daylight, it looked so ordinary, so innocuous, that for a brief, blessed moment, I wondered if I had dreamed the whole thing. Then my grandfather spoke, his back to me as he cracked eggs into a pan. "The cows are gone." It wasn't a question, he knew. My voice cracked and I had to try again. I saw the lights. The spatula in his hand went still. His shoulders tensed, then slumped in resignation. He didn't turn around. "I figured as much," he said quietly. "You looked at the barn, didn't you?" I couldn't lie to him. "Yes." He nodded slowly as if confirming something he'd long suspected. "What did you see?" How could I describe it? What words could possibly convey the wrongness of those figures, the alien quality of their movements, the emptiness in their eyes? But I tried haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, as if speaking it aloud might purge it from my mind. Grandpa Joe listened without interruption, his face impassive, though I saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the edge of the counter. When I finished, he turned off the stove, the eggs forgotten and starting to burn, and sat heavily at the table across from me. "It's happened again," he said, more to himself than to me. He looked older suddenly, the lines in his face deeper, his eyes shadowed with some old grief. "What were they?" I asked. "What did they want with the cows?" He shook his head. "I don't know what they are. Nobody does. They've been coming to this land since before my grandfather's time. Maybe always. But why here? Why our barn? Some places are thin," he said, struggling to find the words. "Like the fabric between here, somewhere else, can be pushed through easier. This farm sits on such a place. Why don't we leave?" The question burst from me, desperate and frightened. Grandpa Joe's expression hardened. "And let someone else stumble into this? Someone who doesn't know the rules, who wouldn't have warning?" He shook his head firmly. "Besides, they're not interested in us. Not usually. They want the animals. Always have. Usually." I latched onto the word, my heart racing again. What happens when they are interested in people? A long silence followed. Finally he spoke, his voice so low I had to lean forward to hear him. "Your grandmother. She saw them like you did. But they saw her too. Really saw her." He rubbed his weathered hands together as if trying to warm them. "She was never the same after. Had nightmares. Couldn't sleep. Said she could feel them watching her, even in broad daylight. Said they'd marked her somehow." A chill ran through me, remembering how the creature looked directly at me, how I'd felt and known by it in some fundamental way. "She got sick," Grandpa Joe continued. "Doctors couldn't figure it out. She just faded away. Before the end, she said they were calling her, that they wanted to show her things no human was meant to see." "Am I?" I couldn't finish the question. Grandpa Joe reached across the table and took my hand, a rare gesture of physical affection from him. "You're going to be fine," he said with a fierce certainty that I desperately wanted to believe. "They only just noticed you. We can protect against that." That day, we drove into town and bought 7 new cows from a farm auction. We worked from dawn until well after dusk reinforcing the barn, not with stronger wood or better locks, which would have been useless, but with symbols carved into the support beams, with bags of salt, and iron nails hammered into specific patterns, with bundles of herbs I didn't recognize hung from the rafters. Protective measures, Grandpa Joe called them. Folk magic passed down through generations of his family, knowledge accumulated by those who had lived on this land and survived its strangeness. Will it keep them away? I asked. We finished, the new cows settling nervously into their unfamiliar home. "No," he admitted. "Nothing keeps them away entirely, but it directs their attention where we want it. On the animals, not on us." That night, and for many nights afterward, I slept in Grandpa Joe's room on a cot beside his bed. He kept the shotgun close and a jar of some foul-smelling liquid on the nightstand, which he said would mask my presence from unwanted attention. I didn't ask what was in it. Some things I was learning were better left unknown. The lights came back 3 more times that year. Each time we followed the rules. We stayed inside, drew the curtains. We didn't look. In the mornings after, the cows would be agitated but present. Whatever the symbols and salt did, they seemed to work. As months passed without incident, the raw terror of that night gradually dulled to an anxious wariness. I could function again, go to school, do my chores, even enter the barn during daylight hours, though I never felt entirely comfortable there again. Grandpa Joe watched me carefully for signs of the sickness that had taken my grandmother, but whatever mark the encounter had left on me, it seemed to be fading rather than deepening. By the time I left for college at 18, the lights hadn't appeared in over 2 years. I chose a university far away, eager to escape the farm and its memories. I studied engineering, surrounded myself with science and logic and rational explanations for the world's phenomena. I almost convinced myself that what I'd seen that night was some kind of hallucination, a child's overtired mind creating monsters from shadows. Almost. Grandpa Joe died during my senior year of college. Heart attack, sudden but not unexpected for a man who'd smoked for 60 years and worked hard labor his entire life. I returned for the funeral, sold the livestock, and closed up the house, intending to sell the property as soon as possible. But something held me back. Some sense of responsibility, perhaps, or the warnings my grandfather had repeated so often about leaving the land to someone who didn't know its dangers. So the farm sat empty for years, visited only by a local handyman I paid to check on the place occasionally. I built a life elsewhere, career, relationships, an apartment in a city where the nights were never truly dark and the nearest cow was a comfortable distance away. And yet, the farm remained mine, a wound that wouldn't quite heal, a question that wouldn't quite fade. Which is why, 17 years after I left, I find myself standing once more before the old barn as the sun begins to set. The place has weathered the years poorly. The house needs painting, the fence is broken in places, the barn's roof sags ominously. But it's still here, still standing, still keeping its secrets. I've told myself I came back to finally sell the place, to close this chapter of my life for good. But as darkness falls and I remain rooted to this spot, I know the truth. I came back for answers. Was what I saw real? Were those creatures from some other dimension, as my grandfather seemed to believe? Were they aliens, as I sometimes theorized in my more scientific moments? Or was it all an elaborate delusion, a shared family madness passed down like an heirloom? The rational mind I've cultivated over the years insists it couldn't have been real. Such things don't exist in the world of physics and engineering where I've made my home. And yet, standing here, feeling the familiar soil beneath my feet, I know what I saw. The sun dips below the horizon. I should go inside, follow the old rules. Lock the doors, draw the curtains. Don't look. Instead, I remain where I am, watching the barn as night claims the farm. Part of me hopes that nothing will happen, that the night will pass uneventfully, and I can dismiss the memories as a childish fantasy. Another part, a part I don't fully understand or trust, hopes for the opposite. The first stars are appearing overhead when I see it, a faint blue glow beginning to emanate from the cracks in the barn's weathered walls. The same unearthly light I saw all those years ago. My heart hammers against my ribs. My mouth goes dry. Every instinct screams at me to run, to hide, to look away. But I'm not a child anymore. I'm a man who has spent 17 years wondering, 17 years running from this moment. The glow intensifies, pulsing gently like a living thing. And this time, I walk toward it.